We oftentimes think of user experiences as this thing that's just handled by designers, and designers think a lot about user experience, of course, but as developers, we need to be thinking about it too. This is going to come into play in our own sort of personal projects where we're just not working with designers, but also even working at big tech companies where you have lots of designers to help out. They're not going to be designing every tiny little aspect of every experience, and you need to understand how, as a developer, to be contributing to that user experience design. And it's not just about like these design principles. A lot of it is just about the way that you go about your work. So for example, one of the most important ways to improve the user experience of your project is simply to shorten the feedback loop with your users. It's easy to get in this mode of thinking, I want this thing to be perfect, so I'm not going to show anything to anybody until it's absolutely perfect. And most of the time, this is not a good way to go about doing things because it's never going to be perfect. You're never going to finish it. And even if you do and you finally release it, you're going to be disappointed when you realize that there's a lot of new work to be done now. Whereas if you shorten that feedback loop, meaning start with a minimal viable product, see how users react to it, make changes, iterate, and then show them the new version and just keep repeating that, you're going to find that you're able to build something that much more closely aligns with what your users actually want. And this is just super important to avoid spending too much time building the wrong thing, because I think that's oftentimes one of the biggest mistakes we make as developers. And now on a similar theme of getting user feedback, it's not just enough to get that user feedback. You also want to be watching actual users use your product. You don't just want to ask somebody, hey, how did you feel about the product? That's important to do too, but you want to be also watching them actually use it. Because sometimes people will say, oh, I actually really enjoyed it, and they'll sort of have forgotten about some roadblock they hit and they're not going to tell you about it. Or there could be some super important feature that you worked super hard on that you want them to experience that they didn't experience at all, because maybe when they used the products, they didn't even see how to get to that experience. They didn't try it out at all. So that in itself is feedback of, hey, I need to find a better way to get to this experience. But that's feedback that somebody can't actually tell you because they don't know that they missed a thing they didn't know about. So it's important to get sort of a balance of feedback from what people actually tell you about using your product and what people can actually show you about using your product by just using it in front of you. That said, it's important with all of this feedback, whether it be directly coming from users or if it's from just observing users using your product, make sure that you're not overemphasizing it. Make sure that you don't get one piece of feedback that this one thing was confusing and go changing the entire application, because that's not really a good way to go about doing things. Instead, make sure to think about all of the feedback you get and contextualize it and see if there's ways you could have made that experience better. But just because one person doesn't like a thing doesn't mean that millions of others won't, so don't overemphasize just a small piece of feedback. And essentially the reason I bring this up is just that you can never get something absolutely perfect for everybody, so if you try to implement every little bit of feedback that every user ever wants, you'll never be done implementing that feedback and you'll never finish the product. Another super important aspect of building a great user experience is simply understanding your users, understanding what exactly their pain points are and what are the things you can be doing to solve for those pain points. And a great way to go about doing this is actually to use today's sponsor, Tally. So Tally allows you to quickly create forums. And by the way, these forums have great user experiences on their own and just tons of really cool features. But anyways, it allows you to create these forums, and in our case, we can use them to gather feedback from our users. And of course, we can do this with active users, but we can also do it super early on with potential future users to understand those pain points and really get to know them as potential users of our product. And doing this type of research before you start building anything is super important to make sure that you're not just wasting a lot of time building experiences that nobody actually wants or needs when there's actually super important pain points that you could have been solving for. So for example, here's a form I created that you all can actually fill out if you want, and this is to make a video request to my channel. And you can see this is the sort of editor that they have, and it works very similar to a document, or if you've ever used Notion, it feels a lot like Notion. So we can change whatever we want. So I created this form. So do you have an idea for a video you'd like to see? What is it? Then we have what type of video is it? And what's cool here is that I'm actually using some conditional logic. So when the type of video is a reaction video, it's going to show this block down here that's going to be, do you need any files or links for the reaction? So I'll actually show you this in the preview. So right here, those questions aren't there. But if I say this is a coding tutorial, nothing changes. But if I make this a reaction video, it's going to add these extra questions of, are there any files? And we could upload a file or any links needed for that reaction. I'm going to go back to the editor, and continuing through the form, we also have this one: is this video time sensitive? And if it is, then we're going to show this block down here of when is the latest this video should be relevant. So if I go to preview again, and we select that this is time sensitive, it's going to come up with this little box here where we can enter a date so that you can tell me when is the last time I could actually make this video. If it's about some news or something like that, then it's going to be time sensitive. Then we also have down here, would this video work best as a collaboration with another creator? And if you say yes, it's going to show the block down here of what creators would you like to see in the video. Then of course we have anything else I should know, so just a sort of other feedback box. And we even have a reCAPTCHA to make sure that none of y'all are bots. I'll actually click down here to add in another block below just to show you that there are tons and tons of different types of blocks we can add. So there's lots and lots of different types of questions we can ask. There's even lots of different things we can do as far as adding different layout, different things we can do as far as adding images and videos into here, and even advanced sort of logical based blocks. So we can calculate fields, we can hide fields, we can use that reCAPTCHA we saw. And what I like doing is this conditional logic of if they said yes to this thing, then we probably want to ask them this follow-up question about it. So it's super nice for that. And then of course there's tons and tons of other things we can do. And once you've actually created the form, there's tons of cool things you can do with it. So I want to show you a few of those as well. So first of all, if we go to share, there's a few different ways to share it. So I could share just a link. You can also use a custom domain. So for example, I can make this some custom domain. So I have connorardman.com, and I could do something like request.connorardman.com, or I could do connorardman.com/request, or whatever domain I wanted to use. I could do that if I wanted to. But one thing I really like is this sort of pop-up embed form that you can do. So if I click on this, you'll see we have this preview where it adds a pop-up on the side of your website. So if I had some website and I wanted to get feedback from users who are actively using my website, I could use this sort of pop-up, and it's going to just give me the code for it. So I don't have to worry about trying to write all this code myself. It just does it completely for me. And of course, there's tons of different things you can actually change about it. I just think that's a pretty cool feature. And one of the other things I like a lot about this is I want to be able to create forms like this and in a way sort of forget about them, not in the sense of forget it exists, but not have to be constantly checking up on it. And it has a lot of integrations that help with this. So I actually integrated it with Notion. So I use Notion to track absolutely everything I do. So I'm going to come over to my Notion here, and you can see this is my video requests. And whenever you fill out that form, it's going to automatically fill in this table with whatever you said. So in this case, I filled it out on November 21st. The idea was to make a video about tally forms, and the type was a reaction. We have the link of tally.so, which is the link you can go to if you do want to use Tally and try it out. It is completely free, by the way. And even if you don't use Notion, you can see on this Discover Integration section that there are tons of different ways you can integrate this. So with Google Sheets, you can use even like Slack, or tons and tons of different ways that you can actually integrate this to get those submissions without having to go back and forth to the Tally dashboard. And one final really cool feature I wanted to show. So I'll go back to edit so that we can actually edit this form. And you'll notice this is a sort of dark theme. And if I go to design here, this is actually the theme I use in my code editor. So that's what I decided to design this as. They have a default light theme if you prefer light mode. And then there's also this dark mode, which is their sort of default dark mode. But I like that you can do a custom theme and theme it however you want. And even if you want, you can go in here and write custom CSS so you can truly make it look however you want it to look, so that, for example, if it's on your website, it follows the theming of your website absolutely perfectly. And really, no matter where it's going to go, you can make it follow your own branding. So whether you're doing user research, growing a newsletter, taking in feature requests, or really just gathering any sort of data from your users or anything that needs a form, really, I would highly recommend you give Tally a try at tally.so. It is, of course, free to use, and there'll be a link at the top of the description. Another important step to making great user experiences is to make sure we critique every aspect of our designs. So for example, why does this button need to be here? Why is it placed where it is? Why is the text on the button what the text is? Do we need this button at all? Is there some different way we could be doing this? All of these questions feel and sound very simple, and in a way they are, but these are the questions we need to be asking if we're going to be intentional about our user experiences, and being intentional about that user experience is what we need to be doing to make it the best and most sort of seamless user experience possible. If we're not going through this process of constantly critiquing ourselves and critiquing our designs, then we're not going to be doing as best as we can to build these great user experiences and to make them better and better over time. And we'll sort of get stuck with whatever came to mind first or whatever we built first, even if it's not the best possible design. We also want to think about our designs in terms of user flows, not just in terms of sort of what they visually look like. So for example, what is the first thing that you think your user needs to do? Well, you should probably put that near the top. Or what is sort of a primary action? You should make that obvious, and you should also probably be putting it near the top. What are the things that are most important that users want to be doing? What are the things that seem like the most common thing that users want to be doing? Make sure that those things are as easy as possible to find and that there's sort of a clear path to get to them. The way I like to think about this is I want to give my users choices, right? I want them to have options of how they're going to interact with my application. But at the same time, I know that there's sort of a most common path, and I want to make that most common path feel like a default. It should feel so easy that if somebody is trying to take that path, they should feel like they had very little sort of thinking they had to do. There were very few decisions to actually be made to get to that common path. Another way I've heard people talk about this is to sort of try to minimize the amount of clicks, the amount of scrolling, and to some extent even sort of the amount of eye movement required to get through this super common path in your application. And of course, every part of your application, every path you can go down should have a great user experience. However, the point here is simply that this primary path should be sort of the primary focus, and it should have the simplest user experience, and it should almost feel like a default to the users. We also want to make sure that we are prioritizing accessibility from the very beginning. One thing I didn't realize for a very long time is that prioritizing accessibility isn't just about making your application usable by as many people as possible and usable by people using different tools like screen readers. It actually makes the application easier for everybody to use. Yes, you are focusing on various disabilities, and that brings you lots of good things, like making sure you have good contrasting colors so that things can be easily seen. However, you're actually making a better user experience for pretty much everybody using your application by doing this. Because essentially you start thinking about various ways that people are going to interact with your application and thinking about ways to make sure that it's still usable for them. And the process of doing that is really a process of simplification, of making the application easier and easier to actually use. But all of us interact with applications in different ways. Even if you're not using tools like screen readers that are sort of explicit accessibility tools, we all interact with our computers and all of the applications we use in slightly different ways. And this process of making the application easier for everybody to use does actually, affect absolutely everybody. Another big focus of user experience design that oftentimes gets a bit overlooked is copywriting, and specifically focusing on really good micro copy, which is essentially just the little bits of text that appear all through our application. So for example, you might have some submit button, and in some cases submit is fine. But in many cases, you should be more specific. Maybe that button should say something like place order. That would be more clear of what exactly that button is actually doing. And this seems like a small thing, and in a way it sort of is, but there's micro copy all through our applications, and all of these small things of every single little bit of micro copy does add up, and it makes a big difference in how easy it is to actually navigate your application. And another place that copywriting in general just tends to be very important, but sometimes overlooked, is in error messages. When something goes wrong, you probably want to tell the user that, hey, something went wrong, and that's fine. But also try to be more descriptive. If you think it's relevant, tell them what exactly went wrong. But even more importantly, tell them what they can actually do about it. What do they need to do to get past the error? Do they need to just refresh the page? Tell them that. Do they need to reach out to your team? Tell them that. Do they need to go to a different page on the website? Well, link them to it and tell them what to do there. Essentially, just don't leave users in this position where they feel completely helpless. Instead, leave them in a position where they feel like they're in control and that they have a clear path to resolving that error. And along with not leaving users in this sort of helpless state, it's also super important to always be providing user feedback, even if there were no errors. So even in this sort of happy path, as we sometimes call it, we want to be giving the users constant feedback that things are working as expected. Have you ever clicked a button and then just thought to yourself, did that work? I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. Do I click it again to make sure it worked? Right? Did I do something wrong? Which is sort of a horrible feeling to have as a user, right? To feel like you did something wrong and there's nothing there telling you what you did wrong. You need to have that confirmation whenever you take some action to tell you that, yes, this thing worked as expected. And this feedback needs to be instant. So sometimes when you click some button, there is sort of a confirmation at some point, but there's a gap, right? Because maybe it needs to send some data to a server or something like that. So it's going to take some time. Well, in this time, show a loading indicator, because that loading indicator is confirmation that we got it. We know you clicked the button and we're working on it. And then once it finishes, so once whatever was being submitted or whatever is complete, then show some confirmation message of, hey, everything worked as expected. So essentially, it doesn't even matter if you're in an error state or in this happy path. We just never want to leave users hanging. We want them to always know the sort of current state of anything that they're doing and feeling like they're not helpless and that everything that they're doing is either working as expected, or if it's not working as expected, they should know exactly what the things are that they need to be doing to resolve those errors. Another aspect of user experience is just the performance of your application. But here's a video I made on why sometimes your code performance doesn't actually matter. And with that said, I do want to say thank you one more time to Tally for sponsoring this video. There's going to be a link at the top of the description. It is, again, free to use, so give it a shot and let me know what you think.